Hello again, Dr. Childress, back on Facebook Live and the internet. Um, I want to talk in this little segment about different variants of the narcissistic borderline pathology that's infecting the family court system. And I want to speak about it as a pathogen, as a public health issue. This particular pathology is caused by a specific set of damaged information structures in the attachment system, having to do with empathies, identity, a couple other networks, memories involved. And so the damage that's caused by the trauma to the attachment networks damages specific sets of information structures in a coherent, organized set. And that this set of damaged information structures then affect the behavior, but particularly the parenting behavior, because it's the attachment system. So attachment trauma and damaged information structures in the attachment system will affect the parenting behavior and the attachment bond to the child. And so that's the ripple of the unresolved trauma up here. And in that pathogenic parenting, the nature of which damaged structures there will be certain variants to the pathology. Now, the pathology itself is very consistent. It's going to follow certain patterns, just like COVID is very consistent. It's a virus, and it will follow certain patterns. Logical thing, or it's not some sort of other disease process. It's a virus and a particular type of virus. But within the virus, it'll start to mutate or start to change into the different variants of the pathogen based on the structure of the COVID virus. Over here, it's based on the structure of the damage to the attachment networks. Which networks are damaged and how did the brain respond to the damage? So for this particular pathology, the main two variants are whether it's a borderline spectrum or narcissistic spectrum. Now, borderline and narcissist are basically just flip sides of the same coin. They arise from having to join a bond to a parent who is both a source of threat and a source of nurture at the same time. So the child's motivated to bond to the parent and to flee from the parent simultaneously, and it kind of fries their motivational system. So the motivational system of the child has to go either one way or the other. Either they flee or they bond. But if they try to bond, then the anxiety gets too high. If they try to flee, then their desire for love crashes. So either way, it's a double bind. There's no win solution on that, which is the source of all the double binds we see in trauma pathology. It is that's the fundamental nature of the trauma for the child, is that double bind of trying to bond to a parent who's both nurturing and dangerous. So the borderline compromise or the borderline solution to that difficulty is the borderline will sacrifice safety for love. They will try to still bond to a dangerous parent. But that means their anxiety is really high because the parent's dangerous and they're vulnerable because they're trying to bond. So their anxiety goes high and they have difficulty developing sort of the structures of self because the anxiety, and so they have difficulty regulating their emotions and intimate relationships because the anxiety gets so high. So on the borderline spectrum variant, we want to bring down the anxiety of the person from the unresolved trauma and sort of bring them back into the social field relative um, to the trauma and their anxiety. The narcissist, on the other hand, their compromise solution for that trauma experience is to sacrifice love for safety. So they, the other parent's not as important, or they don't try to bond to that parent, and so they're safer. Their anxiety is less, which allows them to structure up higher than the borderline, so they're more stable, and they can become successful, whereas the borderline's more chaotic. So because of the less anxiety, they're safe. They can structure up better. The problem is they've sacrificed love for safety, so they're empty inside. And so a lot of times for this variant is a narcissistic man with the wife, and what the women will find is that their husbands or that marry this guy and they think love or closeness will develop over time, and it doesn't, because they have nothing inside. The narcissist has nothing. There's no there. Now that has implications for our kids, because the kids want to receive love from a parent, from that vulnerable parent, fragile parent, and there's no love there. So that child is essentially starving relative to that parent-child bond and the love they are receiving from the bond from this empty, vacuous, narcissistic parent. So that's why they bond to that parent a lot, because that they need that love, and they know the targeted parent's love is there. They feel secure in that love. It's this one that's contingent. The allied parent will only love them if they do what they want. And you see that in this parallel process with the way Trump, he only loves Giuliani as long as Giuliani's meeting. He only loves Barr as long as Barr is doing. He only loves, Sessions as long as Sessions does what I need. And that's the child situation. The child will only get this parent's love if the child surrenders completely to the parent. And any sort of betrayal, you see the savagery and brutality of the retaliation against that person who betrayed the allied parent. There's death threats to these congressmen. They're called vile names, and Sessions is thrown under the bus, and Giuliani's thrown under the bus, and Barr is thrown under. It doesn't Pence. They're hang Mike Pence. He's the most loyal person of all. But if you break with that loyalty, the pathogen is severely retaliatory. And that's what the child faces. This contingent love, the only way they can get the love of this parent is to surrender entirely. And if they try to breach it all with that or do anything that parent doesn't want, they are entirely rejected and punished. And that's why I keep saying we must first be able to protect the child before we can ask the child to show their authenticity. So essentially we have a hostage situation like, Bill Barr or, any of the Mike Pence, where if they break with the narcissist, there's going to be a terrible retaliation against them from the narcissist and from the flying monkeys and from just a hostility and everything that happens. So that's the variance between the two personality types. So the first, when I come into a case and people are describing, that's the first area where I want to go, is this more borderline spectrum, is more narcissist. Now they are the same thing. So the narcissist has borderline underneath it. It's called a borderline core. And the borderline has a borderline core, but they have narcissistic qualities. And so it's just flip sides of the same thing. So a lot of times you'll see me put height parentheses. Earlier I was putting a slash and put the borderline in parentheses because it is narcissistic borderline. The primary feature that I'm concerned about that you see in the child are the narcissistic symptoms being transferred. So this is primarily, I put this in the narcissistic spectrum, which is the abuse pathologies. Narcissistic pathology is the abuse pathology. Spousal abuse, child abuse, that's the narcissist. So that's the variant, the initial variant that I will look at. Now, I would estimate from clinical practice about 2/3, maybe even 3/4 are the narcissistic presentation with an underlying borderline core, whereas 1/4 to 1/3 are more borderline presentations, and they're sort of gender-based. The narcissistic presentation tends to be more the narcissistic male father and the normal range mother, versus a borderline is a borderline mother and the normal range dad. They're not 50-50 because the narcissist zone also has narcissistic mothers who have presentation with a borderline core. So it kind of expands out. But we do have this component with a more purely borderline presentation. And that's typically with the mother who was sexually abused. So she has unresolved sex abuse trauma in her world. And when the divorce happens, she dysregulates around that and her fears about abuse and a lot of false allegations. That's where the false allegations of sex abuse come from, is a borderline who has unresolved trauma. And sex abuse allegations, they need to be, I'm coming out of child abuse, they need to be investigated. But when there's no there, we look at the potential for a borderline spectrum that has unresolved trauma from their own sex abuse. And that I take that kind of a little personally. So sometimes you'll see me put borderline in parentheses because a child who's been sexually abused, or a young woman who's been sexually abused, or rape or something, that's not a pathology in them. They're victims of sex abuse, and but they don't disclose because the society does not support the disclosure of that at this point. And so they never gets treated, never gets resolved, and they try to just move on. And then, but because they have difficulty with their emotions, especially intimacy, because of unresolved trauma, we then call them borderline and pathologize them additionally. So now she's been sexually abused, and then we pathologize her by calling her a personality disorder. I don't agree with that. I don't like that. I don't like pathologizing my little girls who've been sexually abused and nobody treats them. So you'll see me put borderline in parentheses a lot. I don't do that with narcissists. They're more cruel. They've sacrificed love for safety. The borderline's still trying to get love. And so the prognosis is better and everything's better on that spectrum. It's just they have unresolved trauma. My goodness, we got to get in there and help them. The narcissist is a more difficult situation and has a lower prognosis on my part. They don't want to self-reflect. They don't have the capacity to do that. The absence of empathy, they're just cruel. So I have a little bit more resistance to the narcissistic spectrum. So that's the first variant that I'm looking at. So when parents come and tell me, start to present their information, I'm looking at which one do we have, narcissistic presentation or borderline. The interesting one is when the father has been the victim of sexual abuse. And so I get the father presenting a more borderline presentation, as if it was a borderline mother of sex abuse, but I got the father doing it. And it's got some very specific symptoms associated with it that it's an interesting one. It's a nasty one too, when the father's been sexually abused. So that's the first variant. In addition, this is a public health issue because it's a pathogen, it's a set of damaged information structures in the attachment system, and it's transmissible. It gets transmitted from person to person, and it gets transmitted out. So somebody's unresolved trauma will then affect the other people in that person's world and potentially draw in other people as part of the pathology. And that has to do with their joining with the trauma reenactment narrative, the false reenactive narrative, and they're working out their own trauma by joining with this false trauma reenactment narrative. And so those are the allies. And so there's the social distribution feature of this pathogen. It's contagious. And so you see that right now, the contagion spread of the pathogen. So over in COVID, they're telling people to put on masks to prevent the spread of the pathogen. Over in the social surround, we've removed Twitter from the pathogen, and all the YouTube and all the various ways that it transmits its pathology to the more vulnerable minds. And so it's a transmissible trauma pathogen in the attachment networks of the brain. And trauma is pattern. It replicates pattern. And so it's important for every mental health person who's working with this pathology to recognize the patterns of trauma. The patterns of physical abuse, the patterns of sex abuse are really important. The patterns of neglect, and the patterns of psychological child abuse, which are again very important. Physical abuse, the symptoms show up in welts and bruises. The symptoms of psychological abuse are the child's emotional and behavioral symptoms. The monitoring of the child abuse symptoms is, I recommend, through the parent-child relationship rating scale. It measures or monitors 3 symptoms: affection, cooperation, social involvement. Normal range is mid-range. 7 is wonderful. 1 is horrible. We want the child in normal range. If the child's in normal range, I'm a happy hamper. I don't care how bad the other parenting is. If the child's okay, no bruises, no welts psychologically, the other parent can be difficult. And that has to do with Dorsey Pruder and her work, that as well, that when we recover the child, we will be providing the child with the skill set that they can remain stable in response to a pathogenic parent. And so while the parent is still problematic, we can help the child remain stable in response to that parent and thereby get as much love from that parent as possible without becoming symptomatic. But the way we're going to have to do that is by monitoring the child's symptoms of child abuse. So if they return, we protect the child, but if the child learns to stay stable, we're good. And that's using the parent-child relationship rating scale. And again, Ms. Pruder understands all of this. Ms. Pruder can provide appropriate guidance to the mental health professionals and to the attorneys in working with us. A coaching model in which we put the coach to help organize all these people that are involved in the family, the mental health people, parenting coordinators, whatever's going on around this person, attorneys, and put a coach to help organize that into a consistent and appropriate assessment, diagnosis, and treatment for the family, is where I think we need to be going. We need to get this out of the family courts. It's far too expensive to run it through the family courts. We need to get it over mental health, healthcare, get a diagnosis, get a treatment plan, and get that to the courts. And then the courts can work with the structure of the mental health diagnosis and treatment as we move forward. And Ms. Pruder, Conscious Co-Parenting Institute, and her coaches can all help provide guidance to the mental health people and the attorneys involved in achieving that goal. So with that, I'm going to close off this little issue about the different variants of the pathology. Just there's an initial little variant that we should attend to. Two, actually. One is the IPV spousal abuse one. That's always there. This is a fundamentally spousal abuse, and the parent is using the child as the weapon of brutal and savage spousal abuse. But in weaponizing the child, that becomes child abuse. So that child abuse is diagnosis of what we're responding to, but recognizing that underneath it, the reason for the child abuse is because this is spousal abuse. So we got two abuse pathologies out of this one narcissist. So I want to point out that pattern as well. But there's also another pattern that's particularly disturbing with this pathology, and it involves the cross-gender relationships, same gender too, but the particular difficulty is in the cross-gender ones. And let me explain why that is. There's two parts of our attachment networks, mother and father, and the importance of them, or what they do, depends on the gender of the child. So there's father, son, father, daughter, and those are different. And then there's mother, son, mother, daughter, and those two are different. And so there's two that are cross-gender. Those are the father, daughter, mother, son. And those are the high affection bonds, the cross-gender ones. Then there's two that are same gender, father, son, mother, daughter, and those are the identity and value systems kind of importance. And so when we look at the cross-gender ones, the father, daughter, mother, son, what we have here is a coalition with the allied parent that excludes or rejects the other parent. Now, in that particular pattern where you have a special relationship between a father and his daughter that excludes the mother, that pattern is psychological sex abuse. Okay, it's the boundary violation. Now, it's not sex abuse, but it's a creepy relationship. The daughter has replaced her mother as in the spousal role with her father. And even though it's not sexual, psychologically, the daughter knows that this is wrong. The daughter knows she's betrayed her mom, but she has to keep it out of her awareness. She likes the love from her dad, but it feels problematic. And so that daughter is going to go through a lot of psychological issues unconsciously that she's going to have to really work out. And it's going to really damage her relationship with her mom, because she's going to always feel like she betrayed her mom, and it's like dad, and it's just a problem. So that particular pattern of a special relationship with the father that excludes the mother is a real problem. Real problem. Now, we love wonderful love in the father-daughter relationship. We want absolute massive amounts of love going into that relationship because that's a cross-gender one. That's just the love and bonding network. That's a loving network. And so we love that daddy's princess and the dad's just like rolling over and wrapped around his little finger with his little girl. All that's fine as long as we don't exclude the mother. As long as the child, that little girl, has a balancing influence of her mom and a bonded relationship, then dad just pour that love in. Yay, great. What we don't want to see is a special relationship with the father that excludes the mother. That's the sex abuse ripple. That's the one, and it's a creepy feel. The other variant is the mother-son bond that excludes the dad. And that's also that creepy sex abuse kind of incest thing going on, where the mom here has recruited her son to be her warrior against his own dad. So if you know anything about psychology, that's the Oedipal complex, where the child is trying to defeat his father for his mother's love, for her mother's possession of his mother. And that's like massively creepy, but it was resolved in Freud in like normal stuff when we identify with her dad as a way of resolving that, and that's healthy. But when the child takes on his dad as a warrior and defeats his dad and wins the love of his mother's hand, that's problematic. That's going to be problematic for the boy. He's betrayed his dad. There's going to be all sorts of male kind of bonding things. It's just a nightmare. So I want mental health people to be particularly sensitive to that pattern, where you have a father-daughter that excludes the mother, or a mother-son that excludes the father. Those other two, the father-son and the mother-daughter, where the cross-gender one is there, that doesn't have the creepy sex abuse, incest feature to it, but it is devastating to the child's attachment system. To take a young man and expel the father from his life, or to take a young girl and expel her mother, that's just not healthy for the kid. I'm particularly worried around the girl and adolescence and menstruation and all the changes physically that she goes through, and then being a mother and carrying a child. She really needs her mom as part of that. And it's a healthy process to get that mom's support as the child moves in from the child to womanhood. And to exclude the mom on that is like, oh God. And then the son and the father teaches the values to the son. And relative to that, when you see the father-son bond and the son's being really nasty to the mom, that's not a mom problem. And the narcissist trying to get it to be the son is being really mean and rude and intimidating even of the mom, that it's a problem because of mom's parenting. And that's what's called, no, it's not true. No, that's not how it works at all. The son's treatment of his mother is modeled on the father's treatment of the mother. That's where the son picks it up. He's role modeling what it means to be a man from his father. So if he's being abusive of his mother, emotionally or psychologically, verbally, that's the value system he's being taught from his father, which is essentially, it's okay to be mean to people as long as they deserve it. So as long as your mother deserves your cruelty, then that's fine. Just be as cruel as you want. Just say whatever you want and just rip her heart out. Just have no empathy for her because she deserves it. And you can hear the IPV spousal abuse in that. I hit her because she deserved it. My dinner was cold. She deserved to be hit. It's that deserve things. They deserve to be abused. Whenever you hear that they deserve to be abused, that's the abuse pathogen. That's a narcissistic pathogen. And we hear it all the time with the children as justifying their cruelty to the parent, that they deserve to be. That's the narcissist value system. And so these are just some of the various patterns that we get into. And when I talk about this, I'll use various people to highlight the knowledge bases. So Bowlby is attachment, Mnuchin is family systems therapy, Beck is personality disorders. And I typically use the three of them, Bowlby, Mnuchin, Beck, but then there's Vanderkolk and Tronick and Kohut and ICD-10. But I used Bowlby, Minuchin, and Beck as a foundation, and I put Beck on there as personality disorders because it's important to apply the personality disorder information about narcissists and borderlines, understand the splitting, understand the projections, understand all the manipulative sort of stuff, and that expands out into the dark triad personality, which I think it needs to go at dark triad and vulnerable dark triad, empirically based. So uh, so those are the patterns that we have with the pathology, and the mental health people need to understand and need to know the relevant knowledge to the pathology they're assessing, diagnosing, and treating. Right now, the forensic psychology people do not. There is no requirement to know anything. There's no requirement to apply anything. They're just like, they're massively a major nightmare. Take all off the board. And let me tell you a little bit of a secret about that. If you file a licensing board complaint against them, what the licensing board does, they have forensic psychologists who review these cases, so they'll give it to one of their forensic psychologists to review. So you make a complaint against a forensic psychologist for being ignorant and incompetent, and they send it over to a forensic psychologist. Do they ever open up a case? I'll ask you. Have you filed licensing? Any of you ever had a case investigated or against a forensic psychologist? I bet you no. No, you haven't. They don't open cases against themselves. And so you will not get a review of the case from the licensing board, no matter what it is, because they give it to the licensing board and they say no. So the licensing boards are actually covering up the unethical practices in forensic psychology because they refuse to investigate it, because they give it to forensic psychologists and they say, no, I'm not going to investigate it. So that's the current story with the licensing boards. And what we need to do is just keep submitting to the licensing board the ethics and make them say no over and over and over again, and expose the fact that they are not investigating any of the complaints against forensic psychology. It'd be interesting to do a research study. How many complaints against forensic psychology are made? For what? And then how many are investigations opened on? Those are interesting numbers. I'd like to find out those numbers. They might be a matter of public record somehow, or requested. That's a nice interest. And then you publish it in like the AFCC journal or something of how many licensing board complaints are made against forensic psychologists and how many are investigated. Let's take a look at the data. And then as parents continue to file these licenses, they're free and they're valid. And so if you continue to file these, if you all file on the same arguments, standard 2.04, 2.01, 9.01, 3.04, failure in the duty to protect on 2 counts, and the failure to apply diagnostic systems and identify the pathology. So if the parents start giving the licensing boards the same allegations, that they're being harmed, that there's unethical practice, and the licensing board consistently refuses to even open an investigation of it, we're exposing what's going on. So that's part of it. So as parents just need to sort of consistently be expecting what they're guaranteed by the APA ethics code, and say, hey, licensing board, I'm not getting what the psychology people are supposed to be giving. And the licensing board is a consumer protection agency. They're supposed to be protecting the consumer against unethical psychologists. And the consumer is saying, I got an unethical psychologist, and they're not investigating it. So make them do that over and over and over again to expose the situation. And then what is likely going to happen, because forensic psychology is just not moving. They don't care if they're unethical. They don't care if they hurt you. They don't care about anything other than getting their money. And so if they don't move, then the next phase is of malpractice lawsuits, because the judge is not a forensic psychologist. So the moment we get an independent review, the truth is the truth. They are in violation of all these ethics codes and their duty to protect. That's terrorists off range. And so go after their license on malpractice, because it is malpractice. It's violating 2.04, 2.01, 9.01, 3.04, and your failure in your duty to protect the child from child psychological abuse and the parent from IPV spousal abuse, using the child as a weapon, is professional malpractice. You fail to show proper care. You're negligent. And so that's a problem. But it's not me. I'm ethical. So they're going to have to figure it out. But that's the way it's going relative to the ethical code violations in here. And the truth is, it is what it is, as a famous person once said. So, with that, this is a uh, public health issue. This is a pathogen, just like COVID. It's not a viral pathogen, it's a trauma pathogen. It's a particular set of damaged information networks in the brain that produces a particular set of symptoms. The symptoms are transmissible from person to person, so and particularly in the parent-child bond. So attachment trauma in the parent produces distorted parenting that produces attachment trauma in the child, and it's a transgenerational transmission of this particular trauma pathogen. It has very specific features, very specific symptoms, just like COVID, and there are variants of it that are moving through. So, with that, let me wrap up this little piece and um, everybody stay safe out there. I heard there's like 30,000 people going to be dying a week for the next couple of weeks, and we have a lot of spreader events going on. So, everybody stay safe until we get out of this.